A long time ago, there were godlike beings called keepers, and the creation around them which they called the ether. Two of those beings went by many names throughout the span of time. Most commonly, one was referred to as Dr. Monty, and the other as the Shadow Man. You see, not much is known about their history before the invention of a device known as the summoning key. But it was this device that allowed the keepers to manipulate the ether and create Agartha. What is Agartha? It's essentially another dimension that is beyond anything that we know and don't know. It's a dimension where everything is perfect. The keepers were a lot like ancient scientists. They experimented with a lot of things, and that got them into trouble. The keepers were able to master the ability to travel between dimensions, which led to the discovery of something called the dark ether. It's a powerful energy source that exists beneath creation. Many of the keepers were corrupted by this new power and turned into bad guys we know as apothecons. These guys were led by the Shadow Man. A war raged between the apothecons and the keepers, who were led by Dr. Monty, until finally the apothecons were defeated and banished to the dark ether. Over the span of eons, the apothecons evolved into twisted, monstrous creatures whose only desire was to return to Agartha. They just wanted to come home. But these guys knew a secret. On Earth, there was a gateway to Agartha. So, they sent meteors containing something called Element 115 to various Earths across various dimensions. It was their belief that if humanity waged enough war with each other, a rift would open up, allowing the apothecons to escape the dark ether. Eventually, this does happen. The apothecons escape, so the keepers teamed up with the humans to defend Earth. The apothecons, although really scary looking, are just a bunch of wusses, because they lose the war. Again. After the war, there were 4 knights wielding staves of power. These guys were known as Primus. But with all this magic, fighting, and dimension hopping going on, someone forgot to document the war. Now, there was also another dimension that documented the Great War, but we'll get to that later. Let's just stick with this dimension and fast forward to the 1800s. Element 115 was discovered in the American West. Yeehaw! It was also during this time that a resident of the town, Jebediah Brown, created a piece of something known as the Agarthan device. It's an object that is used to shape our reality. However, it needs 3 things for it to work: the Vril device, blood of an elder god, and an elemental shard. He created the Vril device, but didn't have access to the other pieces. Now let's again fast forward to World War II. Somehow, 3 major powers of the world discovered more of Element 115. The Germans, Japanese, and the Americans. What a coincidence, right? The Germans and the Japanese wanted to use it to create something of a super soldier that would be useful in the war. Group 935, led by German scientists Dr. Maxis and Dr. Richthofen, began experimenting with teleportation. But they screwed up and inadvertently created the first zombie. Seeing his failure, Maxis diverts his attention to making wonder weapons. There was a problem though. Money was low. So, the Nazis stepped in and said, "Hey, I know we're fighting a war and stuff, but we will give you some money if you send us some super weapons." Dr. Maxis went for the deal. Richthofen and Dr. Schuster continued working on the teleporter behind Maxis' back. In the process of experimenting, Dr. Richthofen wanted to use the teleporter himself, but he accidentally teleported himself to the moon, where back in the time of the Great War, the apothecons had created a dark ether pyramid. Of course, he had to touch it too. This resulted in him getting electrocuted and hearing voices telling him to open it up. That electric shock also led to him getting teleported to a jungle called Shangri-La. While Richthofen was there, he discovered the focusing stone and Agartha. A little while later, he was teleported back to Group 935's facilities at Duris and started planning the construction of a moon base. You still with me? Dr. Maxis had a daughter named Samantha. She was neglected by her father, and during one of the teleportation experiments, Richthofen decided it would be a great idea to teleport them away. Samantha got sent to the moon, and her dad to the crazy place. While Samantha was on the moon, Graf and Schuster scared her, and she jumped into the ether pyramid. Meanwhile, her father developed the ability to physically merge with electricity. Eventually, Dr. Richthofen pulls Dr. Maxis out of the crazy place to get him to talk Samantha out of the pyramid. She ends up coming out and is greeted by her father telling her to kill them all, before eventually turning a gun on himself. Dr. Maxis merges with the electronics on the moon, but his death triggers Samantha, and she releases the undead on the base to kill every member of Group 935. What a gal. This is where a group called Ultimus comes in, a group of prisoners who are being used as test subjects for Dr. Richthofen's mind control experiments. In this group was American tank Dempsey, Russian prisoner Nikolai Belinsky, and a Japanese soldier named Takeo Masaki. During this time, Samantha Maxis was going nuts on the moon with her zombies and stuff. So, Richtofen thought he knew how to beat her, and the secret lied within his diary. So Richtofen woke the group up in order to retrieve his diary from Shinonuma. It was a successful mission, and they were able to return safely back to Doris. This is good news, right? Well, no, not exactly. After returning, the next part of the plan was to go to the moon to stop Psycho Samantha. But Richtofen ended up overloading the teleporter, sending the Ultimus crew to Kino in the 1960s. And his diary ended up at the Ascension facility with the Russians. If you know a bit about history, you'll know that during the 60s, the Cold War was in full swing, and the US and Russia weren't exactly the best of friends. Americans and Soviets raided Group 935 and took all their sweet sciencey stuff. The Soviets were experimenting with Element 115 at this time, and they also discovered a second part to the Agarthan device, the blood of an elder god. By the way, remember Samantha? Well, she was able to time travel with the help of Yuri and stalk Ultimus throughout time and space. This is why everything is overrun with zombies. Darn it, Yuri. While Ultimus was fighting off the undead, they discovered a lunar lander and traveled to Ascension. Meanwhile, the White House is under attack by zombies. After surviving the outbreak, they create the group Broken Arrow, a scientific research program sanctioned by President Kennedy to research Element 115. Now let's go back to Ascension. Richtofen remembers that the Vril device is at the Siberian facility. So, Ultimus frees Gersh, this little orb thingy, and he teleports them to Siberia in 2011. Unfortunately, they land in a locked room on the set of George Romero's movie, Call of the Dead. At this time, George Romero was doing some research for a World War II movie when he got his hands on Richtofen's research. This inspires him to make a movie about zombies, using that as a cover-up to do more digging at the Siberian facility. Ultimus arrives and an outbreak occurs. But since they are locked up in some room, they aren't able to get what they came for. Call the Dead cast to the rescue. They bring the Vril device to Richtofen, and once again, Ultimus teleports out of there. Ultimus then makes a pit stop at the Himalayas, aka Shangri-La, in search of the Focusing Stone. Lucky for them, 2 British explorers got there first. The 2 British explorers, known as Brock and Gary, were looking for Agartha when an eclipse occurred and trapped them in a time loop. It's almost like somebody didn't want them finding Agartha. Anyway, Ultimus frees them in exchange for this glowing rock. Finally, Richtofen has everything he needs for his plan. He teleports to the moon, combines the Vril device and Focusing Stone to power the MPD, and swaps his soul with Samantha's. Now he's in control of the zombies and the ether. The end. Kidding, we're not done yet. Remember Dr. Maxis? Well, his consciousness is still in the electronics on the moon. He contacts the other 3 Ultimus members and has them launch rockets at Earth to cut Richtofen off from the ether. Unfortunately, the calculations were bad, and Earth is now in a million pieces. But Richtofen still has control over the zombies. Great. Earth is at the mercy of 2 mad scientists. Before we get any further, let's talk about what's happening on Earth while all the moon stuff was going on. So, Broken Arrow was drilling for 115 near Nuketown when their drill exploded. The CIA and CDC were sent to investigate, but when they arrived, they found that a zombie outbreak already occurred. Apparently, the explosion threw bits of 115 into the surrounding air and caused all the Broken Arrow employees to get infected. Getting back to the CDC and CIA agents, they don't live very long because one of the rockets from the moon hits nearby. Everyone at Nuketown is killed except for one Marlton Johnson, who happened to be hiding in the fallout shelter there. Why was he there? Because he's a conspiracy theorist and wanted to dig deeper into Broken Arrow's experiments. After leaving Nuketown to continue his search, he meets Misty, Russman, and Stuhlinger at the Hanford site in Washington State. I'm talking about Transit. Together, they become Victus. Then Maxis and Richtofen reach out to them. Both scientists were contacting survivors to activate pylons for them, but they each wanted them for different reasons. Maxis wanted to open a gateway to Agartha and reunite with his daughter in order to heal the Earth. Richtofen wanted to mend the rift and gain control over zombies and humans. Oh, I almost forgot. Richtofen could only talk to people who have a connection to the ether, and that's through eating zombie flesh. So the only person he could talk to in the Victus crew was Stuhlinger. The other 3 were contacted by Maxis. Moving on, the crew ends up activating 3 pylons in Maxis' favor. One in Transit, one in Die-Rise, and the last one in Buried. But Maxis is a liar. Instead of healing the Earth, he opens up a rift to Agartha to meet with Samantha and destroys the Earth entirely. On top of that, For revenge, he puts Richtofen's soul into a zombie. When Daddy Maxis arrives in Agartha, Samantha realizes he is an evil old man. So she reaches out to a nicer version of him in Dimension 63 and convinces him to help free her from Agartha. This is the beginning of the documented dimension. In this dimension, a guy named Pablo Marinus wrote about the Great War. This leads to Group 935 discovering 115 a few decades earlier at the Origins site. The Allies didn't like that this kind of power was in German hands, so they sent 3 operatives to investigate. The US sent Dempsey, Japan sent Tak, and Russia sent Nikolai. Before the 3 arrived in France, an outbreak occurred at the dig site. Maxis unfortunately got really ill and became one of the infected. But before he turned, Richtofen took the old hacksaw to Maxis' skull and put his brain inside a drone. That's when the other 3 guys showed up, and all 4 united to form Primus. Their new mission? Free Samantha, and that's exactly what they do. Maxis in drone form goes to Agartha, frees her, and Dr. Monty erases evil Maxis from existence. Monty also gives drone Maxis a new body. Now we get reintroduced to Dr. Monty. He comes up with some great plan and reveals it to Maxis. He wants to create a new reality that is free of corruption and free of the Apothecons. However, he needs the souls of people who have already been through the fracturing of the multiverse. That means Ultimus. But hang on. We'll get back to that in a second. Maxis teleports Richtofen to Agartha real fast and tells him about Dr. Monty's plan. Richtofen needs to retrieve the summoning key in the Chronorium in order for this plan to work. Richtofen travels to 1940 and asks the Illuminati to build him a lab underneath Alcatraz. A few days later, he meets with the warden of Alcatraz, Stanley Ferguson, and convinces him to help them construct and maintain the lab. Richtofen returns to Agartha and finds out that he also has a connection to Victus, and can talk to Stuhlinger the way Ultimus Richtofen did. He uses Stu to get the Victus crew to find the Chronorium for him, then takes their blood samples and has them transferred to Alcatraz, where they stay frozen until a better world arrives. Better world. Yeah, right. Sometime later, Richtofen gets the blood samples of Sal and Finn from Mob of the Dead and hands them over to his younger self. His younger self arrives from Zetsubou, gets the blood vials, and older Richtofen travels to Morgue City, where Shadows of Evil takes place. He recently learned that the summoning key was there. Before Richtofen arrives, the Shadow Man screws with the heads of 4 individuals in Morgue City. He tells them that they've done some bad stuff and that they have to do some rituals to free him and make up for their mistakes. The crew ends up freeing him and then realize that they were tricked. So they put him back in the summoning key, but then Richtofen arrives and takes it, dooming their dimension. Primus then travels to Doris in the undocumented dimension in 1943, a few seconds right after Richtofen sends Sam and her father away in the teleporter. Boom! Ultimus Richtofen dead. Why does he do this? Remember, Monty needs Ultimus' souls in order to erase the Apothecons from reality. 3 more souls to go. Primus goes on to Dreisendrach to get Ultimus Dempsey's soul, Zetsubou no Shima to get Ultimus Takio's soul, and finally, Gerard Grovey to get Nikolai's. In between Zetsubou and Gerard, they stop at Alcatraz for snacks. Then, Richtofen sends the souls to the house, where they can all be innocent children and play with the toys. Maxis somehow gets his hands on the summoning key and frees the Shadow Man from it. The Shadow Man then opens a rift and allows all the Apothecons into Agartha. This is what we see in Revelations. Dang it, Maxis. Monty tasks Primus with defeating the Shadow Man and his followers, which they do, and they also drink the blood vials they get from Blood of the Dead. Because once they give Monty what he wants, he plans to erase them from reality. Monty is pissed, because they've just started a paradox by drinking blood from dimensions that don't exist anymore. Instead of destroying them, he sends Primus back to the Great War, where they start all over again. All the previous events that went down are happening again and again in an endless loop. But wait, I forgot to mention something. In Mob of the Dead, 4 mobsters imprisoned in Alcatraz planned to escape using a makeshift plane. Their names were Sal DeLuca, Billy Handsome, Finn O'Leary, and Al Arlington. But the plan falls through, and the other 3 blame Al and kill him on the roof of the prison. Sal, Billy, and Finn are caught and sentenced to the electric chair. They become trapped in purgatory, where those same events repeat over and over again until this happens. When Al kills the other mobsters, the loop breaks. But this causes other ripples in the timeline. This time, when Primus goes to Blood of the Dead, the Chronorium changes and the Warden stops them from escaping. In order for them to leave, Richtofen has to sacrifice himself. Why? Because the Maxis from Agartha radios him and says that the crew has to get blood from someone who has traveled through more dimensions than anyone else in order for them to open a portal and escape. That happens to be Richtofen. Great War Richtofen wakes up, basically lets Primus Richtofen know that he was useless, and continues the rest of his journey with Nikolai, Dempsey, and Takio. By the way, Nikolai is in charge now. Primus travels to another dimension where Ultimus is imprisoned in the Pentagon and classified. They teleport them out of there, and both groups go to Camp Edward, aka Alpha Omega. Why did they go there, you may ask? Primus and Ultimus have a plan to resolve the paradox. First thing they need is the elemental shard. So, they nab that from Camp Edward, and Dr. Maxis radios them saying it's too late. Turns out, Monty's actually a bad guy. He doesn't want to destroy the Apothecans and end the paradoxes to make a perfect reality. He wants to rule over the multiverse and get rid of anyone that gets in his way. Anyway, Maxis teleports Samantha and Eddie to Camp Edward before getting eaten by Dr. Monty. The two kids watched the entire thing go down. When they arrived, Sam unleashed her rage on Camp Edward and said she would kill Monty and burn the house down. After the Camp Edward shenanigans, Primus, Ultimus, and the kids celebrate their future victory in a forest, but they celebrate too soon. Primus Nikolai poisons their drinks, and then wakes Victus to bring him the Agarthan device, which they build at Tagder Toten. After bringing Nikolai the device, he uses it to destroy the summoning key, and the multiverse collapses with it. He also kills undead Richtofen, and then asks Sam to kill him. Everything as we know it, Monty, Victus, the zombies, Apothecans, Element 115, it all gets thrown into the dark ether. The paradox gets resolved. Eddie and Sam enter the light at the end of the tunnel, and happily ever after, right? Enter the dark ether. From the previous timeline, we know that the multiverse collapsed into one universe free of Apothecans and free of corruption, and the rest of creation got sent to the dark ether, a place under creation and outside of reality. Anyone who survived, including humans and Apothecans, usually ended up twisted by the dark ether into different creatures and monsters that matched their environment. Fast forward to World War II, the Nazis knew they were losing the war, and as a last-ditch attempt, they funded the construction of a particle accelerator. Led by two German scientists, Ulrich Vogel and Lucas Kurtz, Project Endstation was born, also known as the Machine. The particle accelerator worked phenomenally until they screwed up. Kurtz knew this would happen and even warned Vogel about it. Vogel and Kurtz were performing a test on the machine when it malfunctioned and opened a rift to the dark ether. Creatures were pouring in, and the rift infected the air around it, turning Project Endstation employees into the undead. Vogel and his team contained the outbreak, but somehow the cyclotron was operating on its own. He also began studying the victims and found that they were infected by something he called Exoelement 1. Additionally, he created a device that could restore brain activity to zombified soldiers, Der Veschler. Hitler saw the potential of weaponizing Endstation, and he sent Task Force Balder into the Dark Ether to ensure the Reich's victory. Sending that many individuals through the rift at once, however, overloaded the particle accelerator, sending waves of exoelement radiation throughout the lab. Vogel stayed behind to make sure that the task force made it through. When he died, he left behind a daughter, Angelica Hannibal Vogel. You know her as Alexandra Valentina. She is one psychotic. Around 5 or 6 years old, her father was visiting her in her dreams, saying that she should finish what he started in order for him to come back with the milk. Turns out, this isn't her dad, and it's actually an entity known as the One, tricking her into letting him out of the dark ether so he can take over the world. This was the beginning of her descent into madness. Throughout Valentina's childhood, Uncle Kurtz did not let her go to school because of what happened to her dad. But Valentina was a super genius and snuck into his library reading up on biochemistry and physics. By 16, she got accepted into the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. Kurtz got to the acceptance letter first and burned it. A day later, she poisoned him with some tea. She still went to college though, graduated as valedictorian, and joined the KGB before joining Omega Group. What's Omega? It's a Russian spec ops team formed to counter Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. The Cold War was going down at this time, and whatever the US did, the Russians tried to one-up them. But let's go back in time for a sec. In 1945, The Red Army accidentally found End Station, taking cameras in to film their discoveries. Unfortunately, the team that went in was attacked and killed by zombies. A week later, a cleanup crew arrives and sends Kazimir Zykov in to shut off the particle accelerator. He shuts it off but gets trapped in the dark ether, never to be heard of for quite a while. The Red Army cleanup crew also found the film reels of the team that went in a week before. The reels were hidden in a Soviet vault, only to be rediscovered by Alexandra Valentina 40 years later. This footage would end up giving her the approval that she would need to reactivate the cyclotron. She had a hidden agenda though. Omega was sent to End Station to weaponize their findings, but Valentina was really there to study the rifts, to make one of her own, and eventually reunite with Dad. Two scientists, Medvedev and Orlov, were chosen to turn on the collider. They successfully do so, but get infected in the process. On top of that, the rest of the facility gets overrun, and Omega Group flees. Not only that, turning on the power caused multiple breaches to sprout up around the world, including one in Vietnam and another in the Ural Mountains. Now it's the West's turn to come in. Samantha is back. She got her hands on a copy of the End Station footage and sent it to Weaver. She tells him, "Hey, check this out," and he sends a Requiem strike team to investigate. As they uncover what happened at End Station, they meet Orlov and bring back some of his brain function using Der Veschler. After having some flashbacks and remembering why he was there, he agrees to help Requiem shut down the accelerator. The lab blows up, and Raptor 1 saves the day. But Omega's not done yet. They built an outpost around the Vietnamese rift that I told you about earlier, thus Firebase Z was born. Dr. William Peck, formerly an American scientist who worked for DARPA, opened up his own portal and sent Omega Group soldiers into the dark ether to start mining Ethereum and make an unlimited power source. A lot of the miners didn't come back though, or they came back with their skin necrotized. And even then, some came back as mimics or whatever creature the One decided to turn them into. Meanwhile, Dr. Valentina secretly met with Dr. Coldclay to get Peck's blueprints for his portal. Poor girl. She still thinks her dad is alive. During this time, Samantha Maxis was on her way to meet with a defected Omega soldier named Ravenov. He was giving her the deets on what Omega was doing in Vietnam. She snuck around the firebase until she got caught and brought to Peck. Peck interrogated her, but to no avail. When she couldn't be broken, he threw her into the dark ether. Joke's on him. He does not know about her childhood. Out of her anger and hatred toward Peck, she caused an outbreak on the outpost. The portal at Outpost 25 released a gigantic burst of Ethereum radiation, turning everyone but Peck and Ravenov into zombies. They both hid in safe rooms, Peck at Omega HQ, and Ravenov in a village close by. Ravenov called Weaver, telling him that Maxis was captured, and Weaver sends a rescue team. The team rescues Maxis, fights off this giant tree that's apparently an elder god, and moves on to the next mission in the Ural Mountains, aka Outbreak Zombies. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot, Peck got his eye plucked out. So now Omega Group is in the Ural Mountains. A sort of super breach opened up in the Urals, and it created a barrier separating towns from each other like islands. Nobody could travel between locations without a portal. Omega also believed that giant Ethereum crystals were maintaining these barriers. When Peck got there, he was tasked with carrying out a plan called Operatia Inversia. The plan was to use the giant Ethereum crystals to make inversion warheads so that they could launch them to the US and create outbreak zones wherever they wanted. That way, the Soviet army could hop through the portals and win the Cold War. Kravchenko takes over Operatia Inversia and realizes that something big in the dark ether was mobilizing an army. The warheads were now meant to be used as protection against this new threat, which doesn't make sense to me because when Requiem comes to sabotage the missile launch, the missiles are still pointed at DC. Wait, Requiem was here too? Requiem was there to get Ethereum samples and send them back to HQ. Ravenov tells Sam about the warheads, and she radios the team behind Weaver's back. They arrive at a missile silo in Ruka, watch Ravenov win a pay-per-view boxing match, kill a giant purple people eater called Legion, and launch the missiles into the Pacific Ocean as per Sam's request. After launching the missiles, Weaver is pissed. He takes away any connections Sam has to the outside world and can no longer trust Ravenov. But Ravenov still has the audacity to contact Weaver again. This time, a handful of Omega scientists wanted to defect. Their only option for protection was to join Requiem, and reluctantly, Weaver agrees to pick them up, sending a strike team back into the Urals to exfil them. This basically becomes the second Outbreak Easter egg. Kravchenko saw this as his chance to finally stop Requiem from ruining his plans after losing the missiles to the Pacific. So he sent a guy named Dr. Hugo Yeager with a defected scientist. Yeager was tasked with killing the scientists and setting up a trap for Requiem. The Requiem team arrived at the sanatorium only to find a murder scene and a taunt written in blood. Then, as Raptor 1 comes to pick them up, boom! They get bazookaed out of the sky by Kravchenko and captured. Raptor 1 and team are dragged out of the wreckage, forced to give up, and boy were we fooled. Everyone thought Raptor 1 was dead. Heck, I even had a funeral for him. A few days later, an outbreak happens in East Berlin, Mauer Toten. Remember Alexandra Valentina? Well, she tries one last time to bring her dad back. This time she is successful. Apparently, Ulrich had another end station lab hidden underneath Berlin. Using the portal there, Valentina was able to pass through to the Dark Ether and reunite with him. The one, pretending to be Vogel, congratulates her as any evil Nazi father would. But he's got bigger plans in store for her. He gives her a new body and gives her command of his army. Kravchenko arrives on the scene and forces Requiem to stop Valentina from releasing the One. And guess what? Raptor 1 is still kicking, but Kravchenko uses him as collateral. You know, just in case Requiem decides to bail. They can get him back as soon as they're done. Requiem sticks to the plan and brings Valentina to her knees. Then they use her Ethereum-infused body to power a nuke meant to close the portal to the Dark Ether. A killer robot that they met in Mauer Toten named Klaus sacrifices himself, detonating the nuke in the Dark Ether and closing the breach. Afterwards, Kravchenko's like, hey, want your pilot back? Come get him. Requiem grabs him, but Kravchenko isn't gonna let them leave that easily. Luckily, Samantha's powers are returning, and she helps the strike team escape. The last thing we see is the director of the CIA staring at a computer screen, DMing somebody about Project Janus.